I am muted temporarily just because there was that weird clicking noise.
Hi.
All right, Matthew, you're up.
Yeah. So welcome everybody to our panel on creating emotional touchstones and emergent narratives. Welcome everybody. So we angle my computer a little here. So what I'd like to do is to first introduce everybody, and then we will dive into the questions. So hope everybody is safe and well. Is everybody okay? Good.
Sure.
Doing good.
Good.
Yeah, doing some. Yeah, okay.
Okay, good. I'll go first. I'm the moderator, so it's really not all about me. But I'll give my quick background. My name is Mathew Farber. I'm an assistant professor of technology, innovation, and pedagogy at the University of Northern Colorado. So essentially, it's educational technology and teacher education. So I embed things like Twine and Bitsy and storytelling games and narratives in teacher education. And I'm active also at the Interactive Fiction Technology Foundation. I'm on the education committee with them. They have another conference later in the spring called LudoNarraCon, I guess without the Ludo part. Yeah, that's just a little about my background. And currently I'm researching games and social emotional learning. And I enjoyed the last panel I was watching because I recently spoke to Zeba Scott less than a week ago about kind words. So fascinating talk. So building off of that, I'd like to go around and have everybody on the panel introduce themselves. I guess I would go clockwise based on my screen, which I don't know if it's the same as what's broadcasting, but I'll live on the edge. We'll start with Sande Chen.
Hi, and I'm responsible for all the background ambient noise because I have a toddler running around, and I will also be walking around, so that might be a little dizzying. I'm a writer and game designer. I've been in the entertainment industry as well as the serious games side of things, and I have worked on numerous projects, big and small, going from MMOs down to mobile games. And I'm also the SIG leader for the game design SIG of the IGDA.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much. And Kimberly will go next.
Fabulous. Hi, everybody. I've been a games industry professional for a bit over 20 years now. I started on the art side. I have worked my way through various producer positions. I ran an independent mobile studio for about 10 years, which involved a lot of narrative design and narrative writing for mobile games. These days, I work for Oculus, working almost exclusively in VR professionally, but I'm still making mobile games for myself on the side. And I've moved into being a more traditional author. So I have books coming out in sort of print and ebook form in the future. So my path is perhaps a little bit windy.
Great. Thank you. I just got an Oculus Quest last week. So
you're going to have so much fun.
I am. It's the perfect device at the perfect time.
I think we're not going to see you, and we're going to see you more.
And Juliana, I know some of your work also actually through Oculus, through art. So please introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks. I'm Juliana. I've also had a little bit of a windy past, and I've been gravitating back and forth from brand design, brand gaming. I've been teaching UX and UI in some places. A couple of private schools and university, and taught story development and design. And what else? So I've worked in the casual game field mostly, and then I graduated to immersive art, which I'm doing right now, and mostly focusing on healing and working within emotions, as you mentioned earlier, Matthew, and talking a little bit about diversity in gaming. So yeah, a little bit windy.
Well, windy's great, right? That's like a good story, right? So we'll start with the whole concept here of the panel itself, kind of to frame the panel and the talk. So, and really anybody, we can keep this organic because these questions aren't directed to anybody in particular. I will also mention at this point that there is a chat. So I have the chat open, and anybody who clicks on the bottom of the broadcast where it says show chat will see it. But of course, these are also recorded. So we will possibly at the end parse out some questions that are, I guess, the most pertinent to the talk. I'm sorry if we can't get to all of them due to time constraints. So let's start with the first question I have here. I just keep looking to the side. I have two screens, so I don't have a cat about to jump in the frame. So the first question is, what is emergent experience? Why do they occur? Who plays them? Of course, a loaded question for the panel, but so we're all on board in the same thing. Well, again, what is an emergent experience? Why do they occur? And who plays emergent experiences? And I also muted everybody, so just be sure to unmute. I'll mute myself.
Sorry.
Okay, are we muted still?
Nope, we've been unmuted. Sande, why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, to me, I feel that emergent narratives are narratives that the player experiences. So we were talking about the player experience, and that might not necessarily be what you think of as narrative in video games, because we tend to focus on the plot of what the cutscenes are and the dialogue, and therefore emergent narratives don't have most of that. That's this is about what the player brings to the story, and they bring their background, they bring their ideas and their actions, and it comes out of the interaction between the player and the systems of the game and their game mechanics, what they're allowed to do. And that makes for things that game designers may never have imagined that their players may do.
Awesome.
I'm holding
Juliana, do you
overall
have...
now. So I'm trying to.
Yeah. I definitely have to agree with that definition. However, I'm just going to add a spin to this. It's also, emergent narratives come about from a place of needing to coalesce, people coalescing with particular groups that they fall in with, people whom they have a little bit more in common. And finding those groups, whether that be work in a game itself, a AAA, or a casual game especially, or in a social media type game, is kind of important and apparent, especially in bringing together commonalities.
Awesome. So I'm working predominantly in VR, and I think what I'm seeing is somewhere right smack in the middle of both of your definitions. A lot of the emergent gameplay that I'm seeing that's sort of fueling my current definition, because I feel like this definition's evolved over time, is, it's what the players do with your world when they're not playing through your story. So it's, as an example, when one of my children was about 5, they were very into playing a couple of the big AAA games. But what would happen is my husband and I would go through and clear the level of enemies, and then let my children go through and play with all the physics, right? Which and they would make up their own stories, and they would kick over boxes, and they would blow up trees. And so my definition of emergent stays in the game predominantly, and it's all the stuff you do when you're not following what the game designer had in mind.
Is there
I'm muted.
anything
Sorry.
else?
Kimberly, it sounded like you created somewhat of a sandbox by clearing out all the enemies. So yourself and your husband gave like a play space for to create your child's own narrative, almost like you would in a game that's intentionally designed as a sandbox, like Minecraft, for instance.
Right. Yep.
Great. Let's get some concrete examples, perhaps. Maybe some other examples of emergent games and the structure and emotional themes and emergent touch points. Also, again, framing the other questions.
Well, for an example, we all know that Fallout games have become very, very expansive, and they're like sandbox games. And I was watching a playthrough. I was interested in the story, but the person who was doing the playthrough, he was interested in buying, trading all throughout. He didn't follow the story at all. He just wanted to be the tycoon in this world and make lots of money. So he definitely was having fun. He made 4 videos of this, but it wasn't good for someone who was trying to figure out the ending of the story. But you know, everyone gets their enjoyment in different ways, and so that's one example of emergent behavior.
One of my favorites is the warthog jump from Halo. And, you know, people discovered early on that you could blow the warthog, and the warthog is essentially indestructible, or at least in the first iteration of Halo it was. You could blow it into the air a very significant distance. So you started seeing contests and groups of people playing in the game with the idea of who can blow this, you know, this four-wheeler the highest and the furthest and the fastest. It had nothing to do with the game itself, you know, other than the mechanics involved. But it almost became a mini game unto itself. Is, you know, what can we do with the warthog that you're not supposed to be able to do with the warthog? And I think some of these early examples set a new framework for players versus, hey, you have to play through the game and get to the end and woohoo, you won the game. You know, as games got more expansive and people started putting Easter eggs in and people started relying on third-party physics engines to make things happen, you know, the potential opened up. And there are people out there who play games not to play, but to break them and to see what cool stuff they can find.
Wow.
Sure, yeah. Juliana?
Well, I think I might have to go. I mean, those examples were really light and wonderful, but I think I have to go the other route. When I first, and I spoke to my students about this when I first encountered Red Dead Redemption. We were talking about, you know, the historical content and the aspect of the game in which the game was created in a particular time and place. And you sort of, as a game designer, you're hoping that people will adhere to whatever narrative that you're trying to pose. But there are other things that come into play that sometimes you're not even thinking about. For example, in that game, in that era, Black people were still in an era of slavery and being lynched and so forth. So what was happening within the game structure, and it was a negative thing, but I want to put a positive spin on that, is that there were people going after, you know, and creating stories around lynchings and so forth. And then and it was a very dark moment, but out of that place came more discussions and conversation about, you know, how do we deal with the emergent narratives as stories? How do we create them? How do we deal with them? How do we talk about them, converse about them? That create solutions to bring meaning in the world. And further from that conversation came a series of meaningful anti-bullying approaches, which was really great to see.
That's fascinating. Now, as you were describing that, I remembered an article I read about a year ago in the Audubon Society. And it was about, it's the title of it, I just looked it up. It's called Birding Like It's 1899. And it's about the ornithology in Red Dead Redemption 2, which is strikingly accurate. There are turkey vultures, common ravens, snowy egrets. And that in itself became like a mission, and it's on the Audubon Society. It also reminds me of when I was doing my dissertation research, there was a teacher in Toronto using Gone Home, which is a narrative game. And for his students, as a way of an assessment, so he knew they were playing the game, he had them do a 1990s archaeology, so take screenshots of all the 1990s references. And another group, they were doing game references, because like on I forgot, maybe a ketchup bottle, there's an image from BioShock, because the designer also worked on BioShock. So very interesting ways of coming at existing games using this emergent experiential approach. So next question is, I'm going to ask this one. What contributes to the rise of an emergent narrative from a game or experience? By experience, I guess we mean games in general, but also VR. And how do you free your players from normal constraints and rules of a game to encounter emergent narratives? This is for anybody. It's a softball question.
Yeah. I think that if you have a realized world that is rich enough to have a lot of player interactions, that is going to be more conducive to emergent behaviors developing, or emergent stories. And it has to be something that players feel really immersed in the world. Therefore, we do see a lot of the stories about weddings and funerals and so forth, and political action happening in MMOs. Because of that, they already is a social space, and it's a whole world that they can go play in. Of course, there was EVE Online, which is player-driven. But also in some of those, first of all, it doesn't have to be multiplayer. It can be single player, but you do need a large enough world where it feels like you can have space to roam.
I'm going to add that to that. I like Journey, and I like those emotional type games. And what gives people the opportunity to figure out that, oh, I can actually invest in emergent storytelling or come back, is having that element of surprise and wonder. And I think it's really interesting now that there's that trend toward creating emotionful games, meaningful games, without having to use the traditional UI UX, which is, you know, the next gameplay and then the points coming up and so forth. So a game like Journey is sort of void of any instruction. But your task basically is to move into a land and be affected by the grandeur of it. And they've used the artistic quality. They've used art as artistic principles as a backdrop to that. And that even includes like the way the camera comes in and zooms in, and the kind of surprises that pop up from the ground. And I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of people think that because you have a game, you have to play the game. You know, you have to physically play the game, but you really don't have to. And a lot of times, a lot of people really just want to have that sensorial experience by just watching.
I think that, sensorial experience in particular, since I started on the art side of things, is I think important. The number of times, especially when we were seeing the rapid jumps in quality for game art and for game textures, the number of times somebody would complain to me that, you know, they got so involved with looking at the detail in the world that they missed the bad guy coming up behind them.
Yeah.
You know, vision is a very, very powerful tool, particularly where games of all kinds are concerned, whether they be VR games or whether they be flat screen games or whether they be tabletop games, right? We eat with our eyes first, as they say. One of the things I see, you know, a lot of things like cookies, a lot of things like the kinds of breadcrumbs that designers put in, and the kinds of things that the artists and the mechanics designers add for, you know, for joyful moments or for emotional moments, right? Little bits of juicy feedback that, if you give a player a portal gun, they are going to test it when they first get it on everything in the environment, right? So, having weird little bits of feedback, having,
The Easter eggs, yeah.
yeah, those little Easter eggs
Yeah.
really draws people out, right? Like, continuing to speak of Portal, right? Ratman, right? They released the comic talking about Ratman, but if you are, in the wrong place, or if you're looking in the right place, you can find a way into the walls to see these narratives laid out. There's very little interaction there, but there's another story hidden within the story. And while those used to be the kinds of things once upon a time the artist would sneak in, right, or the designers would sneak in, now they're becoming almost like a subtext, right? And players will actively look for them because they expect to be there somewhere. So I think you can encourage your players by providing this content and by letting them know it's available. You can encourage them more quickly to discover the emergent elements that, maybe they wouldn't connect with. It's almost like you're giving them permission by saying, well, yes, okay, here's the main game line, but hey, look, there's this flower over here. And if you smell it, you always sneeze. And where does that fit? Right? You give them a hook to build something new off of.
I think that's really neat. And to your point, a lot of the earlier Japanese game designers, Super Mario and so forth, they added those little things, Easter eggs and so forth, which eventually evolved over time into the development of ARGs and so forth. So transmedia ARGs, all those typical type of games like I Love Bees and so forth, and Halo 2, that allowed people to go out and actually create that emergent narrative outside of the actual story. And it was really exciting when they were able to come together, work as a group, figure out what you were talking about, Kimberly, all the little the Easter eggs, and then finally find out in the end whatever the surprise was all about.
Great. So a couple of quick things. I've been peeking at the chat. So Sande, the fifth panelist, has gone a little viral in the chat. A lot of cute comments. And there was another comment I read somewhere in there about your experiences writing games, maybe some specific games or projects, if you wanted to share, of course. I'm a games researcher, so my experience is a little bit more limited, except for some research style projects.
So there was a question about, sorry, we're having a meltdown here. I mean, I can speak specifically in terms of, I mean, as a narrative designer, you have more than just writing and dialogue and at your disposal. You have level design, and you have artwork and sound design as well. But in addition, you can think of nonlinearity. Okay, you want to just say hi? She's a camera fanatic.
There you go.
She's the emergent narrative.
Exactly.
Yes.
Here's our example.
Okay, don't press any buttons. But I think we were talking about you still want to be in camera? Okay. A trip to the supermarket, and if you frame the stakes of it, okay. Okay, you really want to be in camera? All right.
There you go.
If you frame the stakes of it clearly, like you really need this particular item at the supermarket, then the player can kind of feel that story versus, it's just a trip to the supermarket. You don't feel that drama, right? And then we talked about it being, if you have one, you need to get the hand sanitizer and somebody else scoops it up. That's one bad thing, but to add drama, you can go for the second thing. So you could go from one thing like the hand sanitizer and somebody else scoops it up, And then you have a second event where you've already designed it. There's only going to be one item in the aisle. You need toilet paper, and the same person scoops it up. And you're not really actually determining what's going to happen. You're just setting it up, the situation. So it would be even more dramatic if you went for your third item. And it's also very scarce as well. And you need that item for whatever purpose is in the story.
There's a meme going around, which is not funny, but it's Pac-Man, and they say it's like, you're avoiding the ghosts in the supermarket these days. But it does also remind me of Ian Bago's recent book. It opens with a story about going maybe to Walmart and making a game about it, making a game about everyday things. And yeah, that's what games are, right? A possibility space for players. Would anybody else like to share their background and how that relates? Or specific games you worked on or anything like that?
Sure. So, a lot of my background, a lot of my narrative design tends to be emergent. I usually end up getting involved when the need for narrative design or the need for writing in a game that I'm working on becomes apparent, partway through or halfway through. So I don't often get to design from like soup to nuts. A couple of the ones that my studio created a few years ago, we had Agilist. We had a couple of other titles that were all along the lines of more sort of action-oriented light novel type mobile titles. And one of the things that we were truly trying to do was encourage the development of a community by building in emergent gameplay elements, by building in things to these games that you could do that weren't part of the gameplay, from doors that would open up secret rooms, from visual design elements that would then take you out of the game and take you offline. We had a narrative website that would then provide content that could give you access to these secrets within the game, that dropped blog posts from the characters on a regular basis. So when it comes to sort of placing those emergent breadcrumbs in there to encourage players, it can go a number of different ways. I think if you don't yet have a community established, you have to make those breadcrumbs a little more obvious. You have to make that extra content something easy to discover early on so that players are encouraged to look for it later. But if you are building a second installment or you're building a second piece to the game that already exists and already has a community, then you can be much more subtle and you can encourage the players to work just a bit harder to find what they're looking for.
So I want to go back to that Walmart example, is that we could have a boring trip to Walmart, or we could have a drama-filled trip to Walmart. This is sort of the thing. The danger is that you could build this wonderful world with lots of Easter eggs and things like that, but if the player is wandering around, then they may not find it, or they may not discover any of those things. And that's why it might be good to have some direction toward it. It's the same thing for community building on forums. Just because you build forums doesn't mean you're going to have a wonderful community experience. That's why you have community managers to help direct how it's going to go.
Great.
I think also you have to remember that when you're deciding upon a game narrative, you have to remember that, the hero's journey, you have to connect with that. So whatever you do has to, I think when you write, you have to be able to relate to the characters and to the environment around you. And then what's really interesting is introducing that problem, like, that Sande said and that Kimberly alluded to. And the problem has to be something that that is sort of like, it's obvious, sort of, and that creates a double conflict, like a conflict that's even bigger than what it could possibly be. And so I was working on branded entertainment, and what's branded entertainment sort of does that. You take a product and then you figure out, like, based on community talks and sharing social media, what people are kind of interested in. And if there's a situation, for example, like FedEx, where, oh, okay, there's a problem with maybe they're not driving very fast. They're not getting to your house very fast. So you create a solution to that. Like you write in, like what we did was we wrote in strategies and solutions, created like a racing game on top of that. So you're reinforcing basically the solutions to the problem that you find out from the public, social media and so forth.
Before we move on to the next set of questions, which pertain to emotion, which is also the second part of the title of the panel, there is one question that's really standing out to me as I'm scrolling through the chat. So I'm just going to ask it. So the question for the panelists, what might break immersion in a game where the main character is not player created and may make their own story-driven decisions? Example, Nathan Drake in Uncharted. So this pertains often to ideas around suspension of disbelief as well.
Right. Well, once you break the suspension of disbelief, that's like opening the door for an emergent narrative, right? Every game player experiences that moment when they lose control of the camera, and they lose control of the character. And we do this a lot for sort of the machinima style cutscenes, right? Where you enter a room and then there's a moment where all of a sudden the camera does this little tweak, and then pulls out, and you suddenly realize, all right, I've got to sit on my hands, right? One of my favorite examples is in the original Half-Life game. There's a point in the game about 3/4 of the way through where you get all the gameplay, everything you've been mucking about with, gets pulled down to this one hallway, and the game traps you in the hallway, and you have a number of enemies, and ultimately you get knocked out, and then it begins the next chapter in the game. And I know people who spent hours trying to find a way around this, right? Trying to find a way, but it was a pinch point in the narrative. And I find that the more of those you have, the more of those moments where the player can see a way through, but the character cannot, those are your danger points, right? Those are the moments where if you haven't established the character's capabilities and weaknesses strongly enough, you're going to get frustration. You're going to lose the player's suspension of disbelief. That's going to pop them out, and that's going to start creating emergent moments. Not always good emergent moments because they're driven by player frustration, but taking control away is a key way to sort of break that experience.
Thank you. There was a question also in there, just to be clear, about like the overlap between emergent narratives and metagaming. And metagaming, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but metagaming tends to be outside of the system of the game itself, whereas what we're talking about is within the narratives themselves. So emergent narratives can lead to metagaming, such as transmedia, fan fiction, that sort of thing. All right, so
I would almost suggest that an emergent narrative is the first step towards metagaming. That's when you start exploring the boundaries of your game physics and what you can actually do within the game space, that's the point at which you start thinking bigger. That's the point at which you start looking at the game not as a narrative experience, but as a system that you can then play with, like a sandbox or a set of tools, as opposed to a story.
So moving on to emotions, games afford emotions different than other forms of media. And why do we need emotional touchstones in emergent narratives? Why not let players experience what they experience?
Maybe I'll just add that too. There was a game that came out during the Hong Kong conflict just recently. It was a VR game, I believe, and it was created by a woman and 2 other students. And they really wanted to present their case, their situation, They were protesters, and they wanted to allow people to understand what it was like to be a protester in Hong Kong versus the opposing forces. So they did it in such a way where you basically traveled with them in VR, and you ducked and you got up and you put up your signs and you did whatever you need to do. And it gave people worldwide an understanding of what it was like to be a protester, because so many people were writing in and say, well, why don't you guys do this? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And instead of explaining, we can't, they presented the VR experience, which went over very well. So emotion and creating touch points is a really great way of being able to have other people relate to your work, relate to your situation.
Juliana, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Oh,
Sorry.
in addition, it's more transformative when you have the emotional touch points versus if you don't. So we do want our games to touch the player. We're not necessarily looking to make them cry, but to make them think. Think about this world or what's the meaning behind these actions, and hopefully that comes through.
And emotion is the piece, it's one of the strongest pieces we have to encourage people to engage and re-engage with the content in all kinds of media, in film, in books, in video games. If you fail to make that emotional connection to your player or to your reader or to your viewer, then they're going to wander off and they're going to play it for a while, and they're going to be interested in the systems and they're going to be interested in the math, but they're not going to come back the way that they might if they find an emotional connection. And they don't have to be deeply emotionally invested, but they have to get an emotional kick out of whether they're playing the narrative of the game or whether they're even playing a metagame. There's an emotional cookie that you get when the game has really done its job.
And it's so important to have people come back in many types of games, even, not just MMOs, but the mobile games, and also to have different playthroughs, especially if you have these open world games, you want people to come back and re-experience, or even experience for the first time parts of the content that they haven't gone through yet.
And I think as well, sometimes we do, gaming is when we game, sometimes it's a projection. The characters are projections of ourselves. So, depending on what kind of emotional states we are in, especially now in this COVID crisis, right? So we, especially beginners, are tending to visit games to find out, how can I express myself? How can I relate to the characters or the gameplay? And how can I become, see myself as an archetype? Not just an archetype in the big way of perceiving things, like the victor and the warrior, but how do I become an archetype of a medical person? How do I live that? How do I become an archetype of a teacher? Because now I'm teaching all my kids in my home. Now I'm somebody else. So games, creating these emotional touch points, allow us to play with our identity. And as we progress, because we do progress, and as we come back and revisit those games again, we play them from different points of view.
So to follow up on the idea of emotional touch points in games that can create emergent narratives, as game writers, where has it gone unintentionally awry or wrong, if you could say wrong? But if you're putting in those affordances for emergent narratives through emotional touchstones, could it go wrong or not work as planned?
So I don't have any personal experiences, but I can say that if you give the artistic expression, then often you can start to see some offensive material pop up, and you want to have some moderation on that. And it doesn't even have to be with words, or it just could be like someone just built a stripper joint in a kid's game or something like that with the tools that were given to them. So.
Yeah, anytime you have, user generated content, anytime you give people tools or you permit people tools, they're going to push the boundaries of what's allowed, right? And it's going to be different for every person. It's going to be different for every culture. But you will see, people building giant dongs in Minecraft because, they think it's funny. And it's, this is where things like, if you have large open experiences that you're encouraging people to sandbox, and then you need to have some kind of moderation. Somebody needs to set the rules for the space. Because if there's no rules set, people will set the rules as far out as they can possibly make them, right? They will say, okay, you can have everything. And once you are allowed to do everything, then stuff never works out as planned. But at the same time, allowing those open spaces can create some amazing things as well, right? If you set those boundaries large enough. So, when you're getting into dealing with, with people's emotions, when you're getting into games that are encouraging people to be attached to the world and attached to the characters, there's potential to do really important things with allowing people to, try on different personalities, try on different mental states and mental methodologies. But there is for every action, there's a equal and opposite reaction. For almost as much good, there's almost as much stuff that toes the line over towards, depending on where you are in the world, less acceptable behavior.
And if we talk about Grand Theft Auto, of course, there's this famous Institute of the Prostitute. Maybe there's a message there that you don't want out there that can happen, and it was just through the game mechanics that that it was more profitable for players to do this, and also maybe they thought it was funny. But what does it mean as game designers that we're having this message about women being disposable in our game? So that's the other thing to watch out for, is as part of the game creation process, or the game developers, are we putting out the message that we want to put out?
I think language is really important too in being open to diverse representation. So being able to write or curtail or sort of focus people on what you would like, I think people to think about, which is like maybe include LGBTQ considerations and so forth. And I was going to actually say one of the places where I love to visit is Dreams. Have you heard of that? It's new. It came out on PlayStation 4. Yeah, it's great. And basically it's this giant sandbox where you are able to go in and create your own games. You can be your own game developer and designer. You can basically everything is I think you can download everything from other people. You can search, and if you want a pine tree, you can bring in a pine tree into your game and so forth, and create your levels to whatever you decide. And people can actually come in, visit, and play your game. So it's kind of like create your game, design your game, prototype your game, test your game, and see if it works. And it's great.
Terrific. So we have maybe less than a minute left. So what I'd like to do is thank the panelists, but particularly I also want to thank fellow traveler for the opportunity for us to share this conversation. And some quick plugs, and we'll hand it back to fellow traveler. I can be found right at my name, at Mathew Farber or MathewFarber.com.
And I'm at Sande Chen on Twitter. And I also have a blog that's Game Design Aspect that used to be updated more frequently than I am right now. But it includes a lot of narrative stuff as well as game design.
Oh, I'm Juliana. Oh,
Sorry.
Can't hear you. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm Juliana. I'm at Splash Mango on Twitter, Splash Mango, and good to meet you.
Let's see if my mic will behave. I'm Kimberly Unger. You can find me on my blog at Unger Inc. with INK.
Your mic's going out.
And
Unger Inc.
uh-oh. And my
Okay.
shameless plug coming up in November. I have a book coming out, so I'm going to shamelessly plug that here because it was a lot of fun. So yeah, ungerinc.com is where I can be found.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.